There's a photograph circulating the dark corners of the internet that no federal database will ever admit exists. It shows a woman on her knees, barefoot on marble steps, slick with freezing sleet, her honey blonde hair plastered to her cheekbones, her wrists bound in black silk. She isn't crying. That's the detail that stops people scrolling. 27-year-old Audrey Bennett had smoke-gray eyes sharp enough to cut glass, and for 5 nights in a row, every camera flash in Atlantic City couldn't coax a single tear out of them. The man who put her there was Gaspard Fontaine, 58 years old, Savile Row suit, ivory-gripped Colt Python, and a nightly ritual he'd refined over 30 years of owning the East Coast's most ruthless casino, the Crimson Royale. He didn't beat his prisoners. He undressed their dignity one thread at a time. A blazer on Monday, a dead father's silver watch on Tuesday, the boots off her feet on Wednesday. By the 6th night, he planned to put a needle of fentanyl in her arm and watch the FBI's best undercover agent become a headline she'd never live down. What Fontaine didn't count on, what nobody in that glittering tomb of a casino counted on, was the black Bentley that had been idling in the shadows of the parking deck for 3 straight nights. The man inside wasn't supposed to get involved. He'd come to Atlantic City for a territorial meeting and a bottle of vodka, nothing more. But Kilian Volkov, 37 years old, 6'3", ice blue eyes and a jagged scar running from jaw to collarbone, carried a promise on his finger. A black onyx ring, slipped there 8 winters ago on the night he buried a 16-year-old girl named Anya, and on the 3rd night, watching strangers strip a kneeling woman of her boots and leave her bleeding on frozen stone, that promise woke up hungry. The Brighton Beach Bratva called Kilian Belly Volk, the White Wolf. And tonight, the wolf was done watching. If this kind of dark, dangerous romance hits the spot, smash that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Now let's head back to those marble steps, where the 6th night is just about to begin. Inside the lobby of the Crimson Royale, the scent of Tom Ford cologne mixed with Cohiba cigar smoke and the sweat of men in expensive suits, thickening the air until it felt almost solid. The baccarat table had gone completely still. The croupiers in red vests stood motionless like wax figures. And more than 300 Friday night VIP guests, Manhattan bankers, Philadelphia real estate tycoons, and New Jersey state senators, were quietly waiting to see the newest chapter of a play that had already stretched across 5 nights. Gaspard Fontaine stepped out from behind the crystal bar, his footsteps ringing evenly across the glossy black granite like the surface of a frozen lake. He lifted a silver tray in his left hand, and on that tray lay a glass syringe filled with a liquid as clear as water, 50 milligrams of fentanyl, enough to turn any federal agent into a headline in the next morning's paper. Brutus Hawthorne stood beside his prisoner, his bald head gleaming beneath the Swarovski chandelier, his mouth chewing steadily on a strip of mint gum as if this were only an ordinary evening. He bent down, seized the honey blonde hair of the woman kneeling on the granite floor, and dragged her upright by that very hair. Audrey Bennett didn't make a sound. Over the past 5 nights, she'd learned that screaming only made them enjoy it longer. She stood there, her bare feet so numb she could no longer feel them, her wrists still bound with a black silk chain, and she lifted her chin. It was a small gesture, almost invisible, but Fontaine saw it, and for the first time in 5 nights, he felt something very close to irritation. He smiled to hide it. "I'm giving you one final gift, Agent Bennett," he said, his voice low like a cello. 60 seconds. 60 seconds to tell me the 14 names, and I'll let you leave still yourself. Otherwise, this syringe will turn you into a different woman, a woman the FBI won't want back, a woman your sister in Vermont will have to come identify in 6 months. He placed the Patek Philippe watch from his wrist on the marble table beside him. The glass face turned upward, and he began to count. Audrey looked at him. She looked at Brutus. She looked at the 300 faces watching her from the card tables, from the rows of leather seats, from the second-floor corridor where blonde and red-haired escort girls were leaning against the brass railing. For the past 5 nights, she hadn't said a single word. Not one word when they stripped off her blazer. Not one word when they threw her father's silver watch onto the poker table. Not one word when they fastened the necklace engraved with Fontaine's property around her throat, as if she were a hunting dog. But tonight, at the 50-second mark, she opened her mouth. Her voice was hoarse from 3 days without enough water, but it rang out clearly enough for even the people at the farthest card table to hear. "I'll remember," she said. slowly sweeping her smoke-gray eyes across the crowd. "I'll remember every face here. Every single one." There was 1 second of silence after those words. 1 second when even the croupiers forgot to breathe. Then Fontaine laughed aloud, a broad, easy laugh, as if she'd just told a wonderful joke, and he lifted the syringe from the silver tray. "Time's up, little girl," he said. He stepped toward her, took hold of her left arm, and the needle flashed for a moment beneath the chandelier light. The needle touched the thin skin inside her elbow, less than 5 centimeters from the vein, and that was the exact moment the entire lobby of the Crimson Royale trembled. The explosion didn't come from inside. It came from the west, from the basement parking garage, a deep, muffled roar rolling through the marble walls, powerful enough to rattle the champagne glasses on the serving trays, and close enough to crack the west-facing windows into silver spiderwebs. The chandelier swayed. Smoke began slipping through the ventilation grates. Fontaine turned his head, and the syringe in his hand stopped moving. Out there in the darkness, 30 meters away, Yuri Petrov lowered his head over the steering wheel of the second truck and silently counted to 3. Inside the black Bentley Continental, Kilian Volkov had taken off his gloves. The Bentley door closed behind Kilian Volkov without making a single sound, as if the car had been built only to keep its owner's secrets. He stepped through the thin layer of snow across the parking lot, his Brioni overcoat resting lightly over his shoulders, and he didn't run. The ones running were the guards in black suits rushing toward the column of smoke on the west side, hands drawing their guns, earpieces filled with the chaotic shouting of Fontaine's security team. Kilian walked against their current. He walked toward the side door of the Crimson Royale, where only one doorman still remained, a young man of about 28, a Glock 19 clipped at his hip, his eyes flicking constantly between the explosion and the door behind him. The man didn't see Kilian until Kilian was already 1 pace away. There was one very brief moment when he opened his mouth to ask something, and Kilian didn't give him the chance to close it again. His right hand in a leather glove clamped around the man's wrist, twisted it 180 degrees, and the sound of the wrist bone breaking was like a dry branch cracking beneath snow. The man collapsed before he could cry out, because Kilian's left hand had already covered his mouth, and Kilian gently lowered him behind the evergreen shrub beside the door. The man's Glock was now in the pocket of Kilian's overcoat. He opened the side door and stepped into the lobby of the Crimson Royale from the east, where no one expected him. Inside was the orderly chaos of rich people, when they believed they might be dying. Smoke had begun slipping through the ventilation system. The Swarovski chandelier was swaying, and 300 VIP guests were shoving toward the main entrance, trampling fallen silver trays and shattered glasses beneath their feet. Fontaine's security team was shouting orders, trying to control the flow, but no one looked east. No one looked toward the man standing 1.90 meters tall in a black overcoat, cutting through the crowd like a salmon swimming upstream. Kilian kept his eyes beneath the brim of his hat, and he searched for her. Audrey was still standing in the center of the lobby. Brutus was still gripping her arm, and Fontaine was shouting something about taking her down to the basement. The crowd in front of her was panicking and surging toward the main entrance, creating an empty space behind her that hadn't existed 30 seconds earlier. Kilian stepped through that space. He came up behind her, and before Brutus could realize someone was within less than an arm's reach, Kilian's gloved hand had covered her mouth. Not hard, just enough to keep her silent. "Quiet," he said, and his voice was so low that only she could hear him amid the screams around them. "I'm getting you out of here. Don't fight me. If you fight, both of us will be dead before we make it 10 steps. Audrey fought him. She couldn't not fight him. For 5 straight nights, her dignity had been stripped away by the hands of men, and the federal agent's instinct inside her snapped awake like a spring compressed for too long. Her right elbow drove backward, aimed at the ribs of the man behind her, and her left heel came down on the top of his foot. Both blows landed, but the man didn't let go. He only leaned slightly, absorbing the elbow as if it were a gust of wind, and she felt the hand over her mouth remain steady, still not tightening, still only firm enough to keep her quiet. "Turn your head," he said. "Look at me." She turned her head, and when her smoke-gray eyes met his ice-blue ones, she stopped struggling. Those weren't the eyes of someone who wanted to hurt her. They were the eyes of a man who had buried something a very long time ago, and today had decided he wouldn't bury one more person. She didn't ask who he was. She only gave one very small nod. He slipped the Brioni overcoat from his shoulders and draped it over her in a single movement, then slid one arm beneath both of her knees, and lifted her off the ground. She was almost no heavier than a bundle of firewood meant for the hearth. They went back the way he had come, through the side door, out into the parking lot, toward the Bentley waiting with its engine running. Behind them, 30 meters away, Gaspard Fontaine finally turned his head away from the explosion to the west, and his eyes swept across the lobby in search of his prisoner. The place where Audrey had just been standing was now empty. The martini glass in his leather-gloved hand slipped from his fingers, fell onto the black granite floor, and shattered into a small glass flower at his feet. The Bentley tore north along Interstate 87, its headlights ripping through the snow that was falling thicker with every passing minute. And for 2 full hours, no one inside the car said a single word. Yuri Petrov drove with his eyes never leaving the rearview mirror, watching every pair of headlights behind them until he was certain no one was following. Audrey lay on her side across the back seat, her head resting on Killian's lap, his Brioni overcoat covering her from shoulders to ankles. She wasn't asleep. She wasn't fully awake either. She drifted somewhere between those two states, and every time the wheels rolled over an uneven patch of road, pain stabbed through her wrists, where the black silk chain still hadn't been removed. Killian didn't touch the chain. He only kept his hand lightly on her shoulder, just enough for her to know he was still there, and he looked out the window as the maple forests of the Catskills began rising on both sides of the road. They turned onto a private dirt road disguised behind a broken wooden fence, drove another 15 minutes through steep slanting curves, and the mansion appeared beyond a line of Douglas firs 20 meters tall. It was a 3-story cedar house, standing on a granite foundation, its sloped roof covered in snow, its chimney releasing a thin thread of smoke into the night sky, and every light inside hidden behind charcoal velvet curtains. There was no sign, no house number, nothing on any map to suggest the place existed. Dr. Henrietta Ashford was waiting on the wooden porch, a 52-year-old woman with salt and pepper hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, wearing a gray cashmere sweater and carrying a leather medical case worn at all 4 corners. She had once stitched bullet wounds in a field hospital in Helmand Province, and nothing disturbed her anymore. She only nodded to Killian as he carried Audrey across the threshold, then led the way upstairs toward the second bedroom on the 2nd floor. The room was warm, with a 4-poster bed covered in wool blankets, a cast-iron stove burning, and a door leading into a private bathroom lined with gray stone. Killian set Audrey down on the edge of the bed. Henny knelt in front of her, and she said nothing, only took a pair of titanium medical scissors from her case. She slid the blade between the black silk chain and the swollen purple skin around Audrey's wrist, cut once with clean precision, then a second time. The chain fell onto the wooden floor like a dead snake. Henny picked it up with 2 fingers, walked 3 steps to the stove, and threw it into the fire. The silk caught at once, curled into a shriveled black speck, then disappeared. It was the first time since Monday that Audrey let out one long breath. Henny checked her pulse, her blood pressure, her ankles, the soles of her feet where she had suffered 1st-degree cold burns, and when her fingers moved along the hairline at the back of Audrey's neck, she stopped. "There's something here," she said quietly to Killian in English. "A very small, round callus. They implanted something." Killian didn't ask who had implanted it. He removed his gloves, washed his hands in the basin of hot water Henny had prepared, and took the scalpel himself. Audrey saw the blade and didn't blink. She had seen worse things over the past 5 nights. Killian worked in silence, his hands steady like hands that had done this before, and 5 minutes later, he dropped a tiny black silicon chip, the size of a grain of rice, into a glass of distilled water. The chip sank to the bottom of the glass, and its red signal light went dark. Then he went out and closed the door behind him. Henny led Audrey into the bathroom, helped her remove what remained of the nightclothes Fontaine had left her wearing for 5 nights, and left her alone beneath the hot shower for 20 minutes. Audrey didn't cry in the bathroom. She only stood there, her forehead resting against the stone, and let the hot water wash away layer after layer of the 5 nights behind her. When she stepped out, a fresh set of clothes was waiting on the bed, gray flannel pants, wool socks, and an ash-gray cashmere sweater that was clearly far too large for her. She knew whose sweater it was. She put it on, and the scent of cedarwood, gunpowder, and the faintest trace of beluga vodka wrapped around her shoulders like a second layer of armor. She walked downstairs, bare feet on warm oak, and found Killian sitting beside the fireplace in the living room, a Sig Sauer P 226 resting on the coffee table beside him, along with an oilcloth and a cup of black coffee. He didn't turn his head when she sat down in the armchair opposite him, but he pushed a second cup of coffee toward her. She took it with both hands. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice still hoarse but clearer than it had been that evening. "The undercover agent list. FBI information. Fontaine's bank accounts. What is it? I've paid more than enough over the last 5 nights, so don't waste your time playing savior." Killian set the oilcloth down. He placed the Sig Sauer to one side. He didn't look at her right away, but instead looked into the fire. "In Brooklyn," he began. "In the winter of 2016, I had a younger sister. Her name was Anya," Killian said, and every time he pronounced that name, the muscle in his jaw beneath the scar running from his chin down to his collarbone tightened slightly. She was 16 years old, a sophomore at Edward R. Murrow High School, good at math, hated literature, and had eyes the same color as yours. Smoke gray. You know that color isn't natural. There's no eye color like that in the Volkov bloodline, but my mother had it, and she passed it to her, not to me. I called her Little Wolf, because she followed me all over Brighton Beach like a shadow. In November of 2016, I was in Moscow discussing a vodka route with a family on the bank of the Moskva River. I promised I'd be home in time for her 17th birthday on the 18th. I didn't make it back in time. He stopped, took a sip of coffee that had already gone cold, and his ice-blue eyes stayed fixed on the fire, as if there were a film inside it that only he could see. Gaspard Fontaine's men took her outside a bookstore on Brighton Beach Avenue on a Tuesday afternoon. They brought her down to an underground casino in the basement of an Uzbek restaurant in Sheepshead Bay. They didn't beat her. They didn't violate her. They did something worse. They displayed her for 3 straight nights on a wooden platform in the middle of the baccarat tables, like a prize for anyone rich enough to place a high bet, to send me the message that my father and I no longer owned Brighton Beach. On the 3rd night, when they left the room to count money, she took off the silk nightgown cord they had forced her to wear, and she ended herself before I could land at JFK Airport. I reached that restaurant at 4 in the morning. I killed 11 men that night. Not one of them was Fontaine, because he was too smart to be there. I buried Anya in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, plot number 17 in the eastern section, beneath a dogwood tree that blooms pink every April. For the birthday she never got to celebrate, she had already bought me a gift, a black onyx ring. I put it on my index finger the first night after the funeral, and I've worn it for 8 winters. He lifted his right hand, and the firelight reflected across the dull black stone. Audrey looked at the ring, then looked up at the face of the man telling the story, and for the first time since he had carried her out of the Crimson Royale lobby, she saw a crack in his armor of ice. Not a crack of weakness. It was the crack of something that had been welded back together with molten metal, and had cooled into a shape that could never return to what it had been. She set her coffee cup down on the table. "My father's name was Thomas Bennett," she said quietly. "He was a first-grade detective with the New York Police Department, Organized Crime Division. In March of 2009, when I was 12, he was investigating a money laundering network running through 3 casinos in Atlantic City. He found enough evidence to trace a $24 million check back to a shell company in Delaware, operated by a French lawyer named Gaspard Fontaine. He promised my mother he'd be home in time to take us out to dinner on Friday. On Thursday, he left the 63rd Precinct in Brooklyn at 10 at night. At 11:15, a refrigerated steel truck lost control on the Belt Parkway and slammed into his car in the innermost lane. The truck driver was never found. The case was ruled an accident. My mother died of breast cancer 3 years later without ever knowing the truth. My sister, Madison, who was 17 then, started using opioids after our mother died. I joined the FBI when I was 22, and it took me 5 years to follow the name Gaspard Fontaine from a shell company in Delaware to a casino in Atlantic City. She looked straight into his ice-blue eyes. I entered the Crimson Royale 3 months ago under FBI orders to gather evidence. I didn't go in there to be rescued. I went in there to kill him within the law. A long silence settled between them, broken only by the crackle of burning wood in the fireplace and the sound of wind from the Catskill forest striking the window frame. Then Killian set his coffee cup down. "We've been in the same war," he said softly. "Longer than either of us thought, Agent Bennett. 3 days passed in the Catskill Mountains, and they weren't 3 days of healing, but 3 days of observation." Audrey Bennett woke each morning with her knees a little less swollen, the frost-burned skin on the soles of her feet peeling away to reveal new, pale pink skin underneath, her wrists shifting from black-purple to the faint yellow of bruises beginning to fade. Henny visited her twice a day, checked the incision at the back of her neck, changed the bandage, and left behind a tray full of protein and electrolytes that Audrey obediently finished. She smiled at Henny. She thanked Yuri when he carried firewood up for the stove in her room. She nodded to Killian every time they crossed paths in the kitchen early in the morning, and behind every polite gesture, she was doing the same thing she had done for the past 8 years at the FBI. She was building a profile. Her investigative instinct wouldn't allow her to believe that a man with 15 armed bodyguards, 3 Bentley Continentals, and a battlefield surgeon on staff had carried her out of the Crimson Royale lobby simply because of a vow made to a ghost. No one saved anyone for free. She had known that since she was 12 years old, the night her mother told her to go into her room while she took a phone call from the precinct. By the 3rd night, she began moving through the cedarwood house after everyone had gone to sleep. She walked barefoot across the oak floors to measure the creak of each plank, mapping the house in her mind the same way she had once mapped the 3rd floor of the Crimson Royale. The ground floor had the living room, the kitchen, the library, and the dining room. The 2nd floor had 5 bedrooms, one of them always locked, while Killian slept in the northeast corner room. The 3rd floor was an attic she hadn't reached yet, but what caught her attention was the steel door at the end of the ground floor hallway, the door leading down to the basement, the door with a biometric fingerprint lock she had never seen any member of the staff touch. On the 4th night, she passed the library at 11 o'clock and heard Killian speaking on the phone in Russian. He didn't know Audrey Bennett had spent 3 years studying Russian at the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California, before she applied to the FBI. She stopped outside the half-closed door and listened. He was talking about bank accounts in the Cayman Islands. He was talking about a money trail from Atlantic City through Panama and into a trust fund in Liechtenstein. He was saying one name, Fontaine, and he was talking about $24 million that had flowed back into a Delaware account 8 years earlier. The same number her father had been investigating on the night he died. She went back to her room and sat on the edge of the bed for a very long time, her fingers tracing the faint yellow bruises on her wrists, her mind fixated on the black onyx ring she had seen on his index finger. The next morning, she saw Yuri leave a spare key ring on the table outside in the yard. One of the keys was shaped very much like the key to the steel basement door. At noon, when Killian went out with Yuri to check the security perimeter, she borrowed the key ring, went down the ground floor hallway, and the 3rd key fit. The door opened onto a concrete staircase leading down to a windowless room, coldly lit by white fluorescent lights, with 12 computer monitors running across 3 walls. The first screen was a heat map of the Crimson Royale building. The 2nd screen was Fontaine's real-time money flow chart. The 3rd screen was a list of 43 names, among which she recognized the name of a state senator, 2 federal judges, and the chief executive of a rival casino in Jersey City. The 4th screen was a file with her photograph, not her FBI profile photo, a photograph taken 3 months earlier, the first day she had walked into the Crimson Royale as a temporary accountant, taken from across the street. She backed out of that room, locked the door, returned the key to its place, and went upstairs to sit by the window until the sun sank behind the line of Douglas firs. He had been watching her before he even knew her name. He hadn't saved her because of a vow to his sister. He had saved her because she was the only living tool left that could lead him to Fontaine's Liechtenstein account. And when she no longer had value, she would be returned to the FBI or to some hole in the Catskill forest. At 2 o'clock in the morning, she put on his gray wool coat, slipped the small Sig Sauer into her pocket, took the spare key ring, and went down to the 3-level garage beneath the house. The black Bentley Continental was parked in space number 2. She unlocked the car door, and when she sat down in the driver's seat, a low voice sounded from the dark corner of the garage. "Would you like coffee?" Killian asked. He was leaning against a concrete column, 2 steaming white ceramic cups in his hands, and his ice-blue eyes were as calm as the surface of a frozen lake. "Before you leave," he said, holding 1 cup out to her, "there's something you should see." Audrey sat still in the driver's seat of the Bentley for 3 more seconds before she pulled the key from the ignition. She didn't get out right away. She looked at Killian leaning against the concrete column with 2 steaming cups of coffee, and she calculated how long he had known she was coming down here. The answer had to be from the moment she touched the spare key ring on the yard table, perhaps even before that. She stepped out of the car, closed the door with her elbow, and took the cup of coffee he held out to her. "Follow me," he said, and he turned his back and walked ahead, either trusting that she would follow, or trusting that if she didn't, she was no longer worth trusting at all. She followed. They walked down the concrete hallway toward the steel door she had opened at noon, but this time Killian didn't use a key. He placed his index finger on the biometric lock. A green light blinked, and the door slid sideways, opening into the room with 12 computer monitors. A man was sitting at the central desk, about 31 years old, with short red hair cut in a military style, tortoiseshell glasses, a gray turtleneck sweater, and jeans worn thin at the knees. He stood when they entered, and he smiled at Audrey as if she were an old friend whose file he had read long ago but hadn't yet had the chance to meet. Finn O'Doyle. He introduced himself in a Dublin accent that had remained intact after 12 years in America. "It's an honor, Agent Bennett. I read your investigative report on the Brighton Beach case from 2022. Clean work." Audrey didn't answer. She set the coffee cup on the table and folded her arms across her chest. "Show me," she said. Finn turned the 7th monitor toward her. On it was a bank transaction from a shell company named Azure Harbor Consulting Limited, based in Panama City, transferring $2 million US to an account at BCI Mirabad Bank in Geneva. The account belonged to a trust entity named the Holloway Family Trust. The transaction date was September 28th of last year. Finn swiped to the next image, a high-resolution security camera photo from the lobby of the Bellagio Hotel in Las Vegas, taken at 10:14 p.m. On September 29th, 2 men were shaking hands beside a pot of orchids. One was unmistakably Gaspard Fontaine in his 3-piece Savile Row suit. The other was Special Agent Preston Holloway, 34 years old, Audrey's colleague at the FBI Newark field office, the only person besides Special Agent in charge Malcolm Reed, who knew the classified undercover schedule for her operation at the Crimson Royale. Audrey said nothing for 10 seconds. She placed both hands on the edge of the desk to keep them from shaking. Finn continued, "I started tracking this account 6 weeks ago, after Mr. Volkov asked me to review any payment from Fontaine's empire worth more than $1 million. The name Holloway caught my attention because it matched the list of your contact agents in Newark that Mr. Volkov obtained from a source inside the Department of Justice. But what he needs to show you now is something Audrey should sit down before seeing." Finn opened the 4th file. It was a PGP encrypted email that Finn had decrypted through a vulnerability in Holloway's server. The email had been sent by Holloway to Fontaine on the night she was captured at the Crimson Royale. "If Bennett escapes your supervision within 7 days," the email read. "Her sister Madison Bennett is currently in recovery at Birchwood Recovery near Brattleboro, Vermont. Address, therapy schedule, and staff list attached. A public relapse at that facility will discredit Bennett and paralyze her long enough for us to recover the asset." Audrey sat down in the nearest chair. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She only sat there and looked at the photograph of Preston Holloway in the Bellagio lobby, the man she had eaten lunch with every Wednesday for 2 years, the man who had attended her cousin's wedding last August, the man who had cried at her mother's funeral 6 years earlier. Killian stood behind her. He didn't place a hand on her shoulder, didn't offer a tissue. He only stood close enough for her to know he was there if she needed him. After 1 minute, she lifted her head. "What do you want?" she said. "An alliance," Killian answered. "I have the money trail. You have federal authority. Fontaine has both you and me in his sights, but he doesn't know we're standing in the same room. I help you keep your sister alive. I help you close your father's case. You give me access to what the FBI has gathered on Liechtenstein and the Cayman Islands. Your terms, Agent Bennett." Audrey looked at him for a very long time. "No civilians killed," she said. "Not one croupier, not one waitress, not one guard who's only working for a paycheck. Fontaine must live. He must sit in federal court. He must hear his life sentence with his own ears, with all of America watching it live on television. That's how my father went out. That's how Fontaine will go in." Killian gave one nod. "Accepted," he said. Audrey opened her hand. The spare key ring fell onto the table with a sharp, decisive clink. "Agreed," she said. At 7:12 in the morning, before the sun had even managed to cut through the Douglas firs to the east, Finn O'Doyle knocked on Audrey's door 3 times in a row and didn't wait for her to invite him in. She woke at once because she had never slept deeply. He stood in the doorway in the same gray turtleneck sweater from the night before, his tortoiseshell glasses slipping down his nose, an open laptop already in his hand. "Basement now," he said in a Dublin voice stripped of all its politeness. "Killian's waiting. They've got Madison." Audrey didn't ask who they were. She knew. She pulled on her wool socks, grabbed Killian's gray wool coat from the chair, and ran down the stairs barefoot because there was no time to look for shoes. In the basement, all 12 monitors were already on, and Killian stood in front of the central screen, with both hands flat on the table, his shoulders drawn tight as a bowstring. Finn sat down, his fingers leaping over the keyboard as if he were playing a short passage on a piano. "This is Birchwood Recovery's main security camera," he said, pulling a video onto the largest screen, a green-gray image of a therapy hallway in the early morning. At 1:47 this morning, 2 men in the center's security uniforms entered Wing B, where Madison Bennett had been staying for 11 months. 2 minutes later, they came out with Madison, who was wearing pale blue cotton pajamas and slippers. One of the men was holding a prepared IV bag. The other had a hand on Madison's neck, with the practiced movement of someone who had done this before. Audrey watched her sister walking down the hallway with the gait of someone who had been given just enough sedative to obey, but not enough to pass out. And she felt something inside her chest break very softly. Finn fast-forwarded to the parking lot camera. A black Ford Transit van was parked outside the north side door, with no logo and dark film over the rear windows. The 2 men pushed Madison into the vehicle. "License plate," Finn said, zooming in. 4WS5983. Registered to Azure Harbor Consulting Limited. The same Panama name that paid Holloway $2 million. The van crossed the Vermont-New York state line at 3:46 in the morning, heading south on Interstate 87. "I lost them at the Newburgh toll station because they removed the plates, but I tagged the van through signature recognition software, and my algorithm found it again 14 minutes ago. The van is currently parked inside warehouse number 17 at the Port Newark Container Terminal, Elizabeth Marine Terminal." Audrey no longer heard everything Finn was saying. She sat down in the nearest chair and pressed both palms over her face. She cried for the first time since the night her father died. Not loud sobbing, just a silent trembling through her body, her shoulders collapsing, tears slipping through her fingers. Madison was the one who had fed her sandwiches for 3 months after the funeral, because their mother couldn't get out of bed. Madison was the one who had taught her how to fold her scout uniform, and had driven her to her first FBI interview in Quantico. Even though Madison herself had been in the middle of her first withdrawal then, Madison had been clean for 11 months and 19 days. And this morning she had been injected with heroin again by 2 men in fake uniforms, to send Audrey a message about staying still inside a cabin in the Catskills. Killian didn't sit beside her. He didn't hold her. He walked around the table, placed one hand on her shoulder, and bent low enough for her to look directly into his ice-blue eyes at her own eye level. "Audrey," he said, and it was the first time he had called her by her name. "In 20 years of doing things I won't tell you about, I've never broken a promise. I promise you, Madison will be back in this cabin alive before tomorrow's sun rises." She nodded once. She wiped her face with the sleeve of his sweater because she didn't have sleeves of her own, and she stood. "Tell me what you have," she said to Finn. Finn pulled up a 3-dimensional layout of Warehouse 17, 42 meters long, 18 meters wide, 9-meter ceiling, 2 main roll-up entrances and 3 smaller side doors. "I counted 11 adult heat signatures inside through an infrared drone, one of them seated still in the northeast corner, most likely Madison. The weather isn't on our side. The National Weather Service has just issued a Level 3 blizzard warning for the North Jersey area, beginning at 2100 hours tonight. Snowfall is expected to reach 75 centimeters in 6 hours. Visibility below 20 meters. Wind gusts at 70 kilometers an hour. After midnight, no helicopter will be able to fly, and no FBI vehicle will arrive in time." Killian had already left the room. When he returned, he carried a Level 4 tactical bulletproof vest, a black tactical backpack, and in his hand was a brand new Sig Sauer P. 229, still slick with preservative oil. He placed the gun on the table in front of Audrey. "You don't have to go," he said. "Yuri and I can bring your sister back." Audrey picked up the gun, checked the magazine, and flicked the safety off in one smooth movement, as effortless as a girl brushing her hair. "I'm going with you," she said. The convoy left the Catskills at 7 in the evening. 3 black GMC Yukon SUVs with light armor reinforcement, Level 3 bullet-resistant glass, and run-flat tires capable of withstanding .22 caliber rounds. Killian sat in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle, with Yuri behind the wheel. 4 Bratva bodyguards rode in the second vehicle, all of them former mercenaries Killian had recruited from the Donbass battlefield after they deserted. Audrey sat in the third vehicle, the command car, with a driver named Dmitri, and an encrypted communications console connected directly to Finn back at the cabin. The snow began falling hard in Rockland County. By the time they crossed the George Washington Bridge into New Jersey, the wind was already gusting at 70 kilometers an hour as forecast, and Interstate 95 had become nothing but fading streaks of headlights inside a white wall. At 9:30 in the evening, they turned into the Port Newark area. Elizabeth Marine Terminal stretched before them like a city of dead metal. Thousands of shipping containers were stacked 4 stories high, their paint faded and rust red, while enormous gantry cranes stood motionless in the snow like dinosaur bones. Yellow halogen lights mounted on steel poles 12 meters high glowed through the snowfall, turning into blurred halos like streetlights inside a dream. There was no sound except the wind shrieking through the gaps between containers and security chains, striking steel posts. The convoy stopped 150 meters from warehouse number 17, hidden behind a row of Maersk containers stacked 4 stories high. Killian got out, wearing a charcoal Cry Precision tactical jacket, with a long gun case across his back. He opened the case and took out a Barrett M8250 caliber semi-automatic rifle, fitted with a loopholed Mark 6 scope and a weapon-grade suppressor. Finn had custom-ordered himself. "Yuri," he said into the radio, "6 minutes. Wait for my signal." He climbed the fire escape of an abandoned warehouse across from Warehouse 17, 12 steel levels, all the way to the roof. Up there, the wind slashed across his face like a razor. He lay flat behind an old ventilation unit, unfolded the bipod, and looked through the thermal scope. The measured distance was 412 meters. Through the thermal lens, he could see exactly 11 heat signatures, 8 men inside the warehouse, 3 men patrolling the roof of Warehouse 17, each about 20 meters apart. AK-74s slung across their shoulders. Audrey sat in the third vehicle, the Sig Sauer on her lap, the radio earpiece tucked into her ear. Finn was speaking softly from the Catskills. "Agent Bennett, I've got Madison on thermal. She's still in the northeast corner, seated and still, no sign of bleeding." Audrey closed her eyes for 1 second, exhaled, and opened them again. At 10:15 in the evening, Killian let out half a breath and pulled the trigger for the first time. The Barrett gave a deep roar, smothered by the suppressor, and the .50 caliber round cut through the snow, ending the first rooftop guard before the man could hear it coming. He dropped without a sound. 12 seconds later, the second guard turned toward the place where his partner had just disappeared, saw a dark mark on the white snow, and opened his mouth to call out. The Barrett roared a second time. He fell onto that same dark mark. The third guard had already pulled out his radio. Killian didn't give him time to press the button. The third round struck the radio before it reached the man's ear. "Roof is clear," he said into the microphone. "Attack." Yuri drove the first Yukon straight into the front gate of Warehouse 17 at 60 kilometers an hour. The metal roll-up door folded like paper. 4 Bratva bodyguards poured out of the second vehicle, their MP7s flashing with short bursts of fire in the snow. Inside the warehouse came shouting, answering AK fire, breaking glass. Exactly as Killian had calculated, the red alarm lights came on, and the remaining Fontaine soldiers ran toward the front gate to defend it. Exactly as Killian had calculated, except for 2 men. Brutus Hawthorne had chewed through his 3rd stick of mint gum that night, and ever since he had woken from the blow to the back of his neck at the Crimson Royale 5 nights earlier, he had been waiting for this exact moment. He knew Killian Volkov would come for the sister. He knew the agent woman would come with him, and he knew Warehouse 17 had an old storm drain running from the east side of the road, beneath 3 levels of containers, and emerging right behind the Maersk row where the Yukon convoy was parked. He had led Orson Wright and 2 other gunmen into the drain 30 minutes earlier. They crawled through the cold darkness, their headlamps barely bright enough to show the way, and they heard the Barrett roar 3 times above them. When the 3rd rooftop guard went down, Orson surfaced through a manhole cover exactly 12 meters from Audrey's 3rd vehicle. Audrey heard a very soft scrape of metal against concrete, the sound of a manhole cover being lifted, and she sat upright. The footsteps in the snow weren't light. They were heavy, deliberate. 4 men, not Killian's, not Yuri's. She pressed the door lock. She turned off the dome light. She drew the Sig Sauer from her lap, racked the slide, and aimed at the driver's side window. Dmitri, the driver, had already reached for his own handgun, but he didn't get it out in time. A rifle stock slammed into the driver's side window with enough force to fracture the glass, and white spiderweb cracks spread across the level 3 bullet-resistant pane. The second blow pushed the glass inward. The third would break it. Audrey locked her jaw, lowered her shoulders, and set her trigger finger with exactly the kind of tension she had been taught at Quantico. The third blow didn't come. Instead, there was the sharp crash of a specialized breaching hammer, the kind of pointed fire rescue hammer made from tungsten alloy, and the Yukon's level 3 bullet-resistant glass shattered inward like a mirror falling from the 10th floor. Shards of glass sprayed throughout the cabin, into Audrey's hair, onto Dimitri's shoulders, across the control panel flashing red with an intrusion warning. Orson Wright leaned through the broken window frame for exactly 1.5 seconds. His Remington 827 already aimed straight at Dimitri's head, and the young Belarusian driver didn't even have time to turn his neck before he took 2 12-gauge shells from a distance of 30 centimeters. His blood splashed across the windshield in a fan-shaped burst. Orson climbed through the window frame into the driver's seat, the shotgun swinging back toward the rear seat, and Audrey had already dropped to the floor of the vehicle before he could raise the weapon to shoulder height. Brutus Hawthorne came after Orson, climbing through the same window frame with more difficulty because of his size, and when he straightened inside the tilted cabin, he was still chewing his mint gum. "Hello, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with the satisfaction of a man enjoying himself. "Remember me?" Audrey didn't lift her head right away. She pressed her right shoulder against the side of the rear seat, kept the Sig Sauer parallel to the floor, and let the memory of those 5 nights pass through her in the space of about 2/3 of a second. His hand grabbing her hair and dragging her upright in the Crimson Royale lobby, his breath against her neck as he tightened the black silk chain, his laughter when a drunk man crushed her father's silver watch beneath his heel. She let all those images move through her, and she found that no fear remained behind them. The woman who had knelt for 5 nights on granite had died in the explosion at the Crimson Royale parking garage. The woman sitting inside this Yukon tonight was a 27-year-old federal agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, with an expert marksman certification and a thread of revenge that had stretched 15 years from the night her father died on the Belt Parkway. She rose from the floor of the vehicle, the Sig Sauer pointed straight ahead, her smoke-gray eyes unblinking. "Put the gun down, Brutus," she said. "This is the last time." Brutus laughed. It was a laugh coming from the bottom of his throat, the laugh of a man who had killed about 30 people in 20 years of serving Fontaine, and had never met one of them who lived more than 2 minutes after he started laughing. "You don't have the guts, sweetheart," he said. "You're a cop. Cops don't pull the trigger unless—" She didn't hesitate. She didn't blink. She pulled the trigger. The Sig Sauer kicked in her hand with a force as familiar as an old handshake. The 9mm parabellum round traveled exactly 52 centimeters through the air before entering Orson Wright's neck just beneath the right side of his jaw, severing the carotid artery, and exiting through the bones of his cervical spine. Orson fell backward into the driver's seat with an expression that wasn't surprise, but confusion. The Remington slipping from his hand onto the floor of the vehicle, and dark red blood began spreading across the cream leather seat. Brutus froze. In 20 years, Brutus Hawthorne had never felt fear. Tonight, in that final second, he felt it. The fear of a man suddenly realizing the lamb he had tortured for 5 nights wasn't a lamb at all. He reached for his Colt Kimber with painful slowness, and he didn't reach the grip in time. A black shadow dropped behind him from the rear door of the Yukon, which had opened without a sound. Kilian Volkov didn't use a gun. He used the rear stock of the Barrett M82, 4 kilograms of heavy black metal, and brought it down on the back of Brutus's neck, exactly where the occipital bone met the first cervical vertebra. The sound was like a ripe melon falling from a table. Brutus collapsed like a felled pine, face first onto the floor of the vehicle beside Orson, his mint gum falling from his mouth and sticking to the carpet. Silence flooded the cabin. Snow was still falling through the broken window frame. Audrey still held the Sig Sauer level with her shoulder, her index finger still resting on the trigger. Kilian set the Barrett down on the seat, reached out, and gently touched her wrist, and he didn't force her to lower the gun. He only left his hand there long enough for her fingers to recognize the warmth, then slid his fingers beneath the Sig and slowly eased it from her hand. The gun was placed on the center console, on leather already collecting a thin layer of snow from the broken door. He gave one nod, slow and solemn, not comfort and not thanks, but an act of recognition. "Clean shot," he said quietly. "Agent Bennett." Audrey looked at Orson lying dead, looked at Brutus breathing shallowly on the floor, looked at Dimitri slumped over the steering wheel. Her hand found his, and she gripped it tightly, not to ask for comfort, but to remind both of them that they still had a sister waiting inside warehouse number 17. He called Yuri over the radio, and within 90 seconds, 2 Bratva bodyguards had reached the 3rd Yukon, dragged the unconscious Brutus Hawthorne out of the vehicle, and threw him face down in the snow beside it. One of them tore Brutus's coat open to bind his hands with plastic zip ties, checked his pulse, and confirmed that he was still alive. Orson Wright's body and Dimitri's body were left inside the vehicle. Killian turned to Audrey. "Stay here for 2 more minutes," he said, his ice-blue eyes searching hers. "I'll bring your sister out." Audrey wanted to say she was going with him, but she looked down at her hand, still trembling slightly after the shot into Orson's neck, and she nodded. Killian ran toward Warehouse 17 with the 3 remaining bodyguards. Inside, the gunfight at the front gate had gone quiet several minutes earlier. 4 of Fontaine's men lay dead near the roll-up door that had been rammed open, and 2 others had surrendered and were kneeling with their hands behind their heads under the barrels of Yuri's guns. Killian walked straight past them into the northeast corner of the warehouse, where the smell of machine oil and rust mixed with another smell, the smell of sweat, and of someone who had just been injected with something that should never have been injected. Madison Bennett was tied to an old metal chair beneath the only halogen light still working. Her brown hair clung to her forehead with sweat. Her pupils were shrunk small as pinheads, her skin pale green-white like melting candle wax. An empty syringe lay on the concrete floor beneath her feet. Killian knelt, cut the restraints with a folding knife, supported her with his right arm, and carried her out of the warehouse through the blizzard, exactly the way he had carried her younger sister out of the Crimson Royale 4 nights earlier. When Audrey saw Madison's shape in Killian's arms appear through the broken roll-up door, she ran. She didn't walk. She ran. She stumbled in the snow, didn't fall, and when Killian laid Madison down across the back seat of the first Yukon that Yuri had brought over, Audrey had already gathered her sister into both arms. The 2 sisters cried at the same time. Madison couldn't speak. She only leaned into her sister's shoulder and clutched the sleeve of Audrey's gray sweater as if she were holding onto a rope. 14 minutes later, Dr. Henny Ashford arrived at the port in her Range Rover, having driven 130 kilometers through the storm from the Catskills on roads where there were no other cars. She opened her medical case on the back seat, drew out a tube of naloxone hydrochloride, and injected it into Madison's thigh through the fabric of her nightclothes. The reaction came 40 seconds later. Madison's pupils widened back to normal. Her breathing deepened. She opened her eyes for one brief moment, saw Audrey, whispered one single word, "You," then closed her eyes and slept. Henny checked her vital signs again and nodded to Killian. "Stable," she said. "I need to get her back to the cabin within 2 hours for intravenous fluids." Yuri had just finished searching Brutus. He walked over, holding a cord he had folded neatly in his hand. Black silk, dull under the yellow halogen light, about 1.2 meters long, the braided edge marked by a small dried bloodstain that had turned the color of rust. "Found it in his coat pocket," Yuri said in English, because he knew Audrey needed to hear it. He brought it to use again. Audrey looked at the chain that her wrists recognized before her eyes did. She passed Madison into Henny's arms, stood, and walked through the snow toward Brutus. He was waking up. The blood on the back of his neck dried into a black streak, his eyes opening in a narrow slit, and the first thing he saw was the woman he had tortured for 5 nights bending over him with the black silk chain in her hand. Audrey said nothing for 10 seconds. She knelt in the snow beside him. She threaded the chain through his 2 wrists, already bound with plastic zip ties, and tied a careful 3-loop knot, slowly and precisely, the way a silk chain was tied so it wouldn't slip. She pulled one more loop tight for certainty. "You taught me something," she said, and her voice was no longer hoarse. It had returned to the voice of an organized crime investigator. "These silk chains can hold very tight." He couldn't answer because he wasn't awake enough to answer. Alcamoy left Port Newark at 11:40 at night. Madison slept on Audrey's shoulder for the entire 2-hour drive back to the Catskills, her breathing steady as a second heartbeat, and Audrey rested her cheek against her sister's hair and finally closed her eyes for the first time since that morning. 3 nights after the blizzard at Port Newark, the Cedarwood mansion sank into a kind of quiet Audrey had never felt anywhere in her life. Madison was sleeping in the soundproofed room on the 2nd floor, her arm connected to an infusion of lactated sodium chloride, while Henny sat in an armchair reading a book on Crimean battlefield medicine and checking her vital signs every 2 hours. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. The maple forest was frozen beneath the crescent moon, and the entire Catskill region looked like a night photograph caught forever in a single frame. Audrey couldn't sleep. She had tried for 6 hours. She had drunk the chamomile tea Henny made for her, read a few pages of an Agatha Christie novel she found on the shelf, and finally, at 3 a.m, she put the oversized gray cashmere sweater back on, pulled on wool socks, and went downstairs. Killian was sitting in the living room. He sat like a man who hadn't slept for far more nights than one. Beside the fireplace, where maple logs were burning low and slow, he wore black trousers and a charcoal shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and on the table beside him stood a bottle of Beluga Gold Line and 2 hand-cut crystal glasses. He didn't turn his head when she walked in, but he poured vodka into the second glass and pushed it toward the armchair opposite him. She took the glass, sat down, and drank a sip without flinching. "Is she asleep?" he asked. "Deeply," Audrey replied. "Henny says she'll be awake enough to eat by the end of tomorrow." They sat in silence for several minutes, with only the cracking of wood inside the stove between them. Then Audrey set her glass down and said the thing she had never told anyone, not even the post-mission therapist at Quantico. "Baltimore," she began. 24 years old. "I had graduated from the academy 14 months earlier. There was a child abduction case. 7 children in 8 weeks. Dundalk area. A senior agent and I were assigned to watch a storage warehouse near the port. It was raining hard that night. Summer rain. A man led a 7-year-old girl behind a truck. I shouted for him to stop. He pulled a gun. I fired 3 rounds from 7 meters away. The girl survived. I couldn't sleep for 3 months after that. I dreamed of him every night. Not the child." Killian listened to all of it without interrupting, his ice blue eyes fixed on the fire. When she finished, he turned the vodka glass in his palm for a long time before he answered. "Brighton Beach," he said. "Spring of 2004. I was 17. My father, Viktor Volkov, owned 2 dry cleaners and a borscht restaurant on Brighton 7th Avenue. He wasn't involved in the drug routes, but a man named Ruslan Makarov, who moved Afghan heroin through the port, wanted to launder money through my father's laundries. My father refused. One evening in March, Makarov came to the restaurant at closing time with 2 men. My father died on the spot from 3 .22 caliber rounds to the head, a simple execution. Brooklyn police wrote the case down as a robbery gone wrong. 3 weeks later, I found Makarov in a pool hall beneath Ocean View Street. I was 17, holding a 6-shooter for the first time, one my grandfather had brought back from Leningrad. I didn't say anything to him. I shot him 6 times in the doorway of the back room. I don't dream about Makarov. I dream about my father. 8 years later, Anya died. I learned that some memories only grow quiet when life gives us another memory, something even larger to carry. Audrey looked at him. She realized this was the first night he had told her about something that wasn't Anya, and she understood that he was giving her something even more private than the story of Brooklyn in 2016. Killian set his glass down. He removed the black onyx ring from the index finger of his right hand, the dull stone catching a spark of firelight and reflecting it back, and he placed it in her palm. "Anya bought it for me as my final birthday gift from her," he said. "I've worn it through 8 winters. I want you to keep it tonight." She closed her fingers around the ring, and the stone was warmer than she had expected. He leaned forward in his chair, lifted one hand to the side of her face, and bent down to place a kiss on her forehead, light as snow falling on stone. Then he drew his hand back. The radio on the coffee table sounded with one short burst. Finn's voice came from the basement, awake all night. "Mr. Volkov, Agent Bennett," he said. "I've got news. Fontaine has gathered 40 gunmen around the Crimson Royale since yesterday morning. He contacted Agent Holloway 2 hours ago. A federal nationwide warrant for Agent Bennett was issued from the Newark office 10 minutes ago. The charges are treason and collusion with an organized crime syndicate." Audrey tightened her hand around the onyx ring in her palm. She looked at Killian. "Tomorrow," she said, "at 6 a.m, Finn O'Doyle sat before the 12 monitors in the Catskill basement with a cup of black tea and 3 unwrapped energy bars. The route into the internal server of the FBI Newark field office took him 47 minutes, not because the defenses were difficult, but because he had to pass through 3 layers of proxies located in Iceland, Romania, and Singapore so no FBI technician could trace the source back to him. At 7:15, the evidence package encrypted with 4 layers of AES 256-bit protection landed in the private inbox of Special Agent in Charge Malcolm Reed, along with an audio file Finn had assembled from 42 recorded calls between Preston Holloway and two figures inside the Fontaine organization over the past 7 months. Finn typed one final line in plain English. Open before 10 this morning, or miss your only chance to arrest an agent who sold out the bureau. Signed, a friend with no name. At the same time, out in the mansion courtyard, 3 black Bentley Continentals were already running and waiting. Audrey came down the main staircase in an outfit Henny had washed and pressed clean through the night. The charcoal FBI blazer, its shoulders slightly too wide because she had lost 4 kilograms in 8 nights. Black trousers, high leather boots, a white shirt buttoned all the way to the throat. On her left wrist was her father's silver Hamilton watch, its glass newly replaced by a watchmaker in a Flatbush Brooklyn alley after Finn had bought it back from a pawnshop on Atlantic Avenue for $800. Against her chest, hidden beneath her shirt collar, was a thin silver chain, and on that chain hung Killian's black onyx ring. Killian was waiting for her beside the first Bentley. He wore a long black Brioni overcoat, a gray shirt without a tie, and the collar of his coat was closed all the way up to the scar running from his jawbone down to his collarbone. 2 Glock 19s were hidden in shoulder holsters beneath the overcoat. Yuri drove the lead car. 2 Bratva bodyguards rode in the second. The third car carried Brutus Hawthorne, awake now and with his hands bound behind his back by the very black silk chain, his mouth sealed with industrial tape, and on his lap lay a wireless microphone that had captured his entire confession over the past 7 hours, under the influence of a dose of sodium thiopental that Henny had mixed precisely according to a military medical journal, dosage. The convoy left the Catskills at 7:40 in the morning, driving 240 kilometers south along the Garden State Parkway. The snow had stopped through the night, and by noon, beneath the pale sun of late December, the rooftops of Atlantic City had begun dripping with meltwater. At 11:45, the 3 black Bentleys rolled slowly along Atlantic Avenue, and residents stood behind frozen window panes. The croupiers at the Silver Crown Casino looked out. The waitress at Louis' diner set down a coffee cup and stopped pouring. A Polish florist on the corner of Pacific dropped a bundle of white roses. They didn't need to be told that Agent Bennett had returned. They had seen her kneeling for 5 nights on the steps of the Crimson Royale. Now they saw her riding in a convoy led by a man whose story they had heard for 12 years and had never believed was real. "The lamb is dead," someone whispered at Louis' counter, "and she's coming back with the white wolf." At exactly 12 o'clock, the convoy stopped before the main lobby of the Crimson Royale. Gaspard Fontaine had been warned 10 minutes earlier by a source at the Toms River toll station. He stepped out through the brass revolving door, accompanied by 4 assassins in long winter coats with guns hidden underneath, and 2 Manhattan lawyers carrying already signed emergency detention files in crocodile leather briefcases. In his hand was a glowing Cohiba Bahaik 54 cigar, and a glass of Macallan whiskey rested on a silver tray carried by a waiter behind him. Audrey stepped down from the first Bentley. Yuri opened the door of the third car. 2 Bratva bodyguards dragged Brutus out, hauled him through the snow that had melted into muddy slush, and threw him face down on the granite directly before the steps. The black silk chain wrapped tightly around his wrists and laid parallel with his shoulders. When Fontaine looked down and recognized that it was his most loyal hand lying at his feet with the very chain he had given him, the Cohiba Bahaik slipped from his fingers. The cigar rolled once across the glossy black granite, leaving a thin trail of ash, then died in a puddle of melted snow. Killian Volkov stepped over Brutus. He stopped exactly 10 meters from the third step. "I don't care about jurisdiction, Fontaine," he said, his voice carrying down Atlantic Avenue because not a single car dared honk within 3 blocks. "I care about confessions. Your boy Brutus told us a great deal last night. Details about the truck driver who was never found in March of 2009. Details about the basement casino in Sheepshead Bay in November of 2016. And details about the $2 million you transferred to a federal agent through Mirabad Bank in Geneva." Fontaine didn't tremble. He had survived 3 mafia purges and 7 grand jury investigations. He looked at Killian, looked at Audrey, looked at the 2 lawyers standing silently beside him, then lifted his left hand and flicked it once like a man swatting away a fly. "Kill them both," he said lightly to the 4 assassins. 4 hands slid into 4 coats at the same time. Killian didn't draw first. He let the Barrett M82 drop into the snow that had melted into muddy slush, the 4-kilogram length of black metal striking the sidewalk with a low, heavy thud and both his hands had disappeared into the Brioni overcoat before that thud had finished. The two Glock 19s left their shoulder holsters in the same motion as a ballet dancer drawing two swords. The two shots came so close together that the human ear heard them as one. The first round did not enter the chest of the first assassin. It entered the SIG P-226 in the man's hand, knocking the pistol into a spinning arc through the air, along with 4 of the man's fingers torn apart at the middle joints and a spray of red blood thrown back onto his neck. He screamed and dropped to his knees. The second round took the same path through the Beretta M9 in the second assassin's hand, breaking the trigger and 3 bones in the man's hand. The 2 remaining mercenaries froze, their hands still touching their coats but not yet drawn, and they did the wisest thing in their entire mercenary lives. They pulled both hands out of their coats, empty, and raised them beside their ears. Killian did not blink. Both Glock barrels remained aimed straight ahead, one at each man. "Step back," he said quietly. "Drop your coats to the ground." They obeyed. The coats fell into the mud along with 4 other guns. Gaspard Fontaine watched his empire collapse for about 3.5 seconds. Then he reached his right hand inside his vest, where he had carried a Colt Python with a 4-inch barrel and an African ivory grip for 22 years. He had never needed to use it. He had always had men to use guns for him. Today, he drew it himself. The bullet did not come from Killian. Audrey Bennett had drawn the Sig Sauer P-229 from the holster on her right hip during the time Fontaine's hand moved inside his vest, and when his fingers touched the ivory grip of the Python, she pulled the trigger. A single shot struck the stone front of the Crimson Royale and echoed back along Atlantic Avenue. The 9mm parabellum round passed through Fontaine's right shoulder at the exact point above the head of the upper arm bone, tore through the deltoid muscle, and exited through soft flesh behind it without touching the subclavian artery. The Colt Python slipped from his hand before he had fully raised it, fell onto the black granite, and rolled twice before stopping beneath the first step. Gaspard Fontaine collapsed. His knees hit the stone floor. The front of his Savile Row suit fell open, and a red flower bloomed across the right shoulder of the $8,000 suit he had put on that morning. He did not scream. He only took one very deep breath, like an animal that had been shot and was calculating which path death would take. Audrey stepped forward. She was in no hurry. Her high leather boots moved past the Cohiba Bahike that had gone out in the puddle of melted snow, and she stopped exactly 2 paces from him. "Stand up," she said. Her voice did not tremble. It was not high, not low. "The FBI is waiting." He lifted his head to look at her, and in his gray-blue eyes, she saw something she had waited 15 years to see. Recognition. He had recognized the daughter of Detective Thomas Bennett. At that exact moment, from far to the left, the sirens of 4 heavy black SUVs broke the silence on Atlantic Avenue. They pulled up before the front of the Crimson Royale in a tactical crescent formation. The first vehicle opened, and Special Agent Preston Holloway stepped down, leading 6 SWAT officers in Kevlar armor. Their guns were not aimed at Fontaine. Their guns were aimed at Audrey. "Agent Bennett," Holloway shouted, his voice an octave higher than usual. "You're under arrest for treason and collusion with an organized crime syndicate. Drop your weapon to the ground and put both hands behind your head." Audrey did not turn around. She did not drop the gun. She only looked at Fontaine, kneeling beneath her feet, and smiled very faintly. "You're late, Preston," she said. The door of the second SUV opened. A 58-year-old man stepped out in a charcoal FBI wool coat, his gray hair cut short, a leather folder tucked under one arm. Special Agent in charge Malcolm Reed had read all 47 pages of Finn's evidence while sitting inside a Bell 412 helicopter from Newark at 9 in the morning. "Agent Holloway," he said, his voice steady as an early bell. "You're under arrest. Drop your weapon to the ground." Holloway turned his head, his face gone white, and his right hand instinctively touched his holster. He did not draw in time. From the roof of the building across the street, 300 meters away, Yuri Petrov had been lying flat behind a kitchen chimney for 14 minutes with an Accuracy International AX-50. A low shot sounded. The Glock in Holloway's hand blew apart his thumb and flew down onto the steps. He dropped to his knees at once, screaming in pain. The SWAT officers aimed their guns up at the roof, then down at Holloway, then did not know where to aim at all. Reed did not blink. He walked past Fontaine's assassins, clutching their injured hands, past Brutus lying face down, and came to Audrey. He held out 2 pairs of handcuffs, one for Fontaine, one for Holloway. When the work was done, he turned his head toward Killian Volkov. The two men looked at each other across the melted snow. Reed gave one very small nod, not a spoken thank you, because an FBI special agent in charge was not allowed to thank a Bratva boss. Killian bowed his head in return, just as slightly, an unspoken promise that the Brighton Beach Bratva would not become the next matter Reed needed to handle. 3 months passed in the Hudson Valley like a book being turned slowly, page by page. On February 11th, a federal jury in Newark found Gaspard Fontaine guilty on all 14 counts of the indictment. On February 23rd, Chief Judge Eleanor Whitmore of the United States District Court for the District of New Jersey read a sentence that lasted 22 minutes. Gaspard Fontaine, 58 years old, was sentenced to life in prison without parole for organized murder, cross-border money laundering, trafficking minors, and the assassination of a federal agent on duty, Detective Thomas Bennett. On the night of March 19, 2009, on the Belt Parkway, Preston Holloway, 34 years old, was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison without reduction for treason, accepting bribes, and obstructing justice in a federal investigation. The Crimson Royale Casino, the 2 Silver Crown Hotel high-rises, and 7 shell companies on Atlantic Avenue were seized by the Department of Justice under the RICO Act the following Tuesday morning. Madison Bennett completed her full 90-day recovery program at Birchwood Recovery on March 12th, then moved to Montpelier, Vermont, to live with their mother's sister, Eleanor Reyes, in a 2-story wooden house with a blueberry garden. On March 17th, Special Agent in Charge Malcolm Reed stood on the oak platform of the FBI Newark Field Office Auditorium and pinned the Medal of Valor to the lapel of Agent Audrey Bennett, the highest honor the FBI gives to a living agent. After the ceremony, Audrey submitted a request for 6 months of unpaid leave to recover psychologically. Reed approved it without reading through even one full sentence. By March, the Catskills had begun to thaw. The snow pulled back from the roof of the cedarwood house, leaving damp gray marks on the shingles. The maple trees had begun to drip sap into the tin buckets of a neighboring farmer 3 kilometers away. Robins returned earlier than the almanac had predicted. That morning, Audrey wore an ivory white knitted sweater Madison had sent her by mail, black trousers, and low ankle boots. Around her neck, Killian's black onyx ring still hung from a thin silver chain beneath her sweater. She went down the main staircase and toward the 3-level garage beneath the house. Killian was there. He was wearing a pair of earth-brown suede gloves, standing beside the black Bentley Continental, idling quietly, his luggage already loaded into the trunk. He had prepared to return to Brighton Beach. The collapse of Fontaine's empire had left a void in the East Coast underworld, and there were Bratva decisions that needed to be made in Brooklyn, not in a cedarwood mansion hidden in a maple forest. He saw her coming and stopped with his hand on the car door handle. Audrey crossed the cold concrete floor and stopped exactly 1 arm's length from him. She placed her right hand on his arm, over the black Brioni overcoat. Very lightly. "The valley is very quiet when you leave, Killian," she said softly. Killian lowered his gaze to her. For 8 winters, ever since the night he buried Anya in Greenwood Cemetery, he had believed the rest of his life belonged to a stone-paved road in Brighton Beach, to the smoke-stained back rooms of the Bratva, to the solitude he had chosen as a refuge, from memories no one else could share. But as he looked down into the smoke-gray eyes of the woman whose hand rested on his arm, he felt something he hadn't felt in 8 years. Silence inside. The ghosts he had carried through 8 winters had finally sat down beside the fireplace and fallen asleep. "Brighton Beach is cold, Agent Bennett," he said, his voice a little lower than usual. "I think I've been in the ice long enough." He pulled the suede gloves from his hands, tossed them over his shoulder into the front seat of the idling Bentley, and turned off the engine with the key in his other hand. The brass wind chime hanging on the mansion porch above them, the one Henny had hung there since November, was suddenly touched by the first spring wind, and the 6 brass tubes rang through the newly thawed Catskill air with a sound neither of them had heard in many months. Killian Volkov, for the first time in his 37 years of life, had chosen to stay. The story of Audrey and Killian wasn't a story about violence. It was a story about how self-respect can survive after 5 nights of being stripped away thread by thread, as long as a person still has one reason to remember the faces of those who stood by and watched. It was a story about how 2 people who had lost what was most precious to them could find each other, not by accident, but through a 15-year vow and 8 winters, quietly weaving themselves toward the same snowy night in Atlantic City. The greatest lesson this story leaves behind is that dignity isn't something others can take from us through violence or humiliation, but the one thing we can still keep when we decide not to bow our heads, and that family isn't always blood. Sometimes family is the person who appears in the darkest night of our life, with an overcoat warm enough to place over our shoulders and a promise strong enough to carry us away from the place where we were forced to kneel. If Audrey and Killian's story has touched some part of your heart, please leave a like so we know this story has reached the right person. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the deep and meaningful stories we bring you every day. Share this video with someone you think needs to hear this story tonight. A sister, a friend, or someone who's standing up after a long winter of their own. How do you feel about Audrey's journey? About Killian's choice to stay? About the cost and the reward of never breaking a promise? In your own life, have you ever had to hold on to your dignity in front of people who wanted to take it from you? And what helped you stand again? Leave a comment below. We read every line, and we treasure every feeling you write from deep inside your heart. We wish you, the person watching this video, good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days beside the people you love. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.